Hi, everybody. I'm Brittany Lewis with Forbes Breaking News. Joining me now is attorney Jeff Lewis, founder of Jeff Lewis Law. Jeff, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
Big conversation today. Rudy Giuliani's trial began Monday for defamatory statements he made about Georgia election workers after the 2020 election. First of all, as a lawyer, what are your thoughts on this trial?
Well, it's a very unusual trial in that the judge and jury are not going to be determining whether Mr. Giuliani did anything wrong. Instead, his liability has already been determined as a result of a bad discovery sanction in violation of discovery orders. Instead, this jury is just going to be determining how bad were the plaintiffs damaged and should they impose punitive damage against Mr. Giuliani for willful and intentional misconduct.
I do want to talk about the precedence of this. As you said, his liability has already been determined. How common is that, to have your liability be determined before you even step foot into the courtroom in front of a jury?
Well, it's not unprecedented. There was a high-profile trial involving Alex Jones, who was in a very similar situation, sued for defamation, didn't produce documents in response to discovery, so the court struck his answer and his pleadings, and liability was established against him, and the only trial against him was for damages. So it's not unprecedented. It's not unprecedented for a judge to issue discovery sanctions for not complying with discovery rules.
As we already know, former President Donald Trump has been found liable in his civil fraud trial in New York, and that trial is still ongoing. So I'm curious what the legal strategy is when you're going in. They're already liable, but just damages need to be determined.
Well, so you're only limited really to poking holes in the damages theories of the plaintiffs, and you want to make sure you don't do anything to provoke the jury to believe that you did something on purpose. And so, for example, my strategy would be to counsel my client not to have press conferences the day of the first trial announcing that he has no regrets for what he did.
Let's talk about that a little further. Rudy Giuliani did double down in comments saying, quote, "Everything I said was true," and things of that nature. As a lawyer, what do you make of those comments?
Yeah, the only thing I could guess he would be thinking, because he's a former lawyer, is that he's hoping for some sort of jury nullification, that he's going to convince this jury that this is a politically motivated prosecution. Because absent jury nullification or that political prosecution argument, admitting that you have no regrets and you would do it again is an invitation to be hit with a very large punitive damages verdict.
Rudy Giuliani was on Donald Trump's legal team. Does having this type of political role typically shield you from defamation charges?
Not from a legal perspective. It doesn't provide any legal shield. But as I said, jury nullification is a thing. A juror could decide to award these plaintiffs $1 if they felt that this was politically motivated.
He's potentially facing $43 million in damages. Since he was already found liable, is it more likely he will be paying closer to that higher number?
It depends on how the jury concludes whether or not his conduct was willful and malicious, and whether or not they believe a larger number is sufficient to deter him and punish him. That's the key question. And so I would expect a large number, especially given the comments he just made.
His lawyer said that this large number was, quote, civil equivalent of the death penalty. Do you agree? Do you think that number matches what he was deemed liable for?
Well, how do you measure what these two plaintiffs went through in terms of the days following the statements made by Giuliani and his representatives about what they did? How do you measure that harm? They lost their good name. I think the number is going to be very close to that 45 million, and I do think it is appropriate. I don't think they're going to end up getting paid much. You know, Mr. Giuliani's having trouble paying his lawyers. He's got another lawsuit by Dominion. I don't know at the end of the day that these plaintiffs are going to recover anything, but they'll get a big monetary award.
Rudy Giuliani's lawyer has been saying that he doesn't have the money. This will financially ruin him. Does that become a factor at all in the jury's mind?
It shouldn't. In fact, if I were on the plaintiff's side, I would move to exclude that kind of argument, or at least evidence as to that kind of argument, from reaching the jury's ears. On the other hand, one of the primary arguments that a defendant can make is, hey, a very small amount of damages is only needed when you've got a defendant that has very few financial resources. So it should be tied to the defendant's net worth. So I would expect the defendant to try to push that argument.
As a lawyer, do you think there's anything missing from this conversation that you want to add? Because this has been making news for years now. Finally, we're here at trial. What's missing?
Well, I'll say one other thing. Alex Jones recently tried to have his large judgment against him discharged by a bankruptcy court. Ultimately, it was not discharged, meaning that debt will follow him around for the rest of his life. And one of the reasons that finding was made was because the bankruptcy court found that Alex Jones' conduct was willful and malicious. Similarly, if Mr. Giuliani has a similar verdict against him, if the jury makes a factual finding that what he did was willful or malicious, Mr. Giuliani could be faced with not being able to discharge this debt, bankruptcy, and having this debt follow him for the rest of his life.
And do comments like last night saying everything I said was true, does that add to the case that this could be willful and malicious? Can the jury take those, even though they weren't made inside the courtroom?
If I were the plaintiff, first thing this morning, I would try to get those comments in front of the jury, more so about having no regrets than everything was true, because having no regrets goes to a state of mind and what amount of money is needed to punish and deter future misconduct.
And what should we be looking out for next when it comes to this trial?
Look for arguments by the defendants that this is a political prosecution, that the or the jury should only award $1, that the damages claims are exaggerated, that Mr. Giuliani is not responsible for things that third parties, members of the public, did with his comments. He didn't directly ask people to harass these two election workers.
And how strong do you think Rudy Giuliani's arguments are compared to the plaintiff?
Well, he's got an uphill battle. Look, he's already admitted to liability. So on the question of damages, it's just a question of how big the award is going to be. And he's got a very difficult hill to climb.
Jeff Lewis, I appreciate your insights. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me.